By way of introduction to this week's stories from the Deep North, I'd like to recall a moment that occurred about a decade ago. In 2010, reports began emerging from Shenzhen, China, of a rash of suicides at a factory complex run by Foxconn, a multinational corporation that produces electronics. Over the course of a year, 15 workers hurled themselves from the top of dormitory buildings, which Foxconn maintains at that factory site in order to house their employees. The company responded to the crisis by stringing up nets between its buildings in order to catch the falling bodies. Investigative reports soon emerged of a world most of us had scarcely dreamed of. A city, Shenzhen, that in 40 years' time went from being a rural fishing village to becoming a site of global finance, with a population of more than 14 million people. But also of manufacturing sites within the city of Shenzhen that function as cities within a city. The Foxconn plant alone employs and houses 450,000 people, a population that approaches the size of Boston. Most of their employees are women, and many are teenagers, and sometimes they're younger. They've all arrived at the Foxconn plant from rural districts in China, searching for work. Once employed, they're forced to live in those dormitories. They're small rooms stacked high with bunks where 6 or 8 or 10 people are all crowded in. The days are long and the work is painfully repetitive. It soon emerged that the Foxconn plant is but one site among many just like it, where our iPhones are being made. It's one site among many where our laptops and our iPads are being made. But it's also where products for Nokia and Dell and HP and Samsung and Nintendo are also being made. And it was driving people to despair. The reports created a brief stir, but then it all receded. Foxconn claimed to clean up its act, and Apple and all the other companies issued statements about ethical conditions in the workplace. A few years ago, Foxconn was even invited to build a plant in Wisconsin, one which it turns out never materialized. But no one has stopped purchasing iPhones or iPads. In time, the shock of seeing an endless row of women bent over tiny devices, meticulously assembling our products by hand, simply faded from public consciousness. But each and every one of our electronic devices, to say nothing of many, if not most, other consumer objects within our purview, both reveal and conceal that hidden labor force. They reveal in that we know that our phones or tablets didn't originate with Amazon or at the Apple Store. We know they were produced somewhere. But they conceal just how they actually came into existence. They conceal the hands and the faces and the lives that assembled each of those component parts into a functional whole. It turns out that's an old story. Here in the deep north, the tragic legacy of those hidden labor relations lies all around us, in the now abandoned factories that we see in our cities and towns, and in the prosperity that was built upon those hidden hands and faces. If you have eyes to see, the monuments disclosing Connecticut's and all of New England's participation in the slave trade for the sake of economic growth are all around us. Over the past several weeks, we've been able to witness how the New England economy came to flourish through a robust trade with islands in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations were worked by enslaved people who often died of overwork within 10 years of their arrival on those islands. You see, the sugar plantations that New England supplied food for were death camps, but they were also profitable. And for most people, they were invisible, not unlike Foxconn's enormous manufacturing sites. And so few people thought to question that prosperity because the labor was concealed. This week, we'll expand that story just a little bit more by focusing on two sites here in Connecticut that depended upon the laboring bodies of enslaved people. Importantly, those enslaved people were always somewhere far out of sight, so as not to trouble the sleep and the good conscience of those who depended upon that labor. That concealment, however, meant that intense contradictions, moral contradictions, could reside in one and the same place, where a social vision of hospitality, on one hand, could reside with a place where immense profits were being generated from slave labor. Our first visit today will be to the town of Deep River, where both David Good and I will narrate some of the things that occurred in that town. Our second visit will find us in Willimantic, a river town near the center of Connecticut, where Kevin Booker will tell us how that town, together with towns just like it all over New England, mill towns, played a decisive role in the formation of this thing we've been calling the Deep North. And so let's head on out to Deep River. There are a few things I'd like to share with you there. We're in the town of Deep River right now, at the corner of Winter Avenue and Main Street, which runs through the center of town. Here at this corner, you can find a public memorial detailing the story of William Winters, a resident of Deep River until his death in 1899. It's a powerful story, one that's well worth considering on our journey through the Deep North. Winters was named Daniel Fisher at the time of his birth, around 1808. He then lived in a part of Virginia located south of Alexandria, along the Potomac River. He had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. But because of heavy losses, the man who owned him broke up the family in 1827, taking Fisher to Richmond to be sold. He was sold for the price of $550. From Richmond, he was taken to South Carolina, where he was forced to work on a cotton plantation under conditions of cruelty. In October of that year, Fisher and another enslaved man decided to run away, stealing a horse in order to get away quicker. After weeks of wandering, they finally found their way to Richmond. And from there, after several more months of hiding in the woods, fearing recapture, they stowed away on a boat that took them to Philadelphia, dodging slave catchers all the way. In Philadelphia, Fisher and his companions split up, the better to elude detection. Abolitionists in Philadelphia helped Fisher travel to New York, where other abolitionists in that city placed him upon a steamboat, which eventually brought him to New Haven. A contact in New Haven then instructed Fisher to set out for Deep River, where he was to ask for George Reed. Reed was a community leader in Deep River, the owner of the ivory business in town. He was a member of the Baptist Church, and he was also a committed abolitionist. Fisher did as he was told. He made his way from New Haven to Deep River on foot, encountering many obstacles along the way. But when he finally arrived, he located George Reed, who immediately took him in. Reed advised him to change his name immediately, suggesting the name of William Winters, which Fisher adopted for the remainder of his life. Reed also gave him a wig with which to disguise himself, which Fisher, now Winters, wore, again, for the remainder of his life. From 1828 until 1850, Winters resided here in Deep River, but after the fugitive slave law was passed, he felt compelled to flee the town. That law required anyone with knowledge of an escaped slave to turn them in under threat of punishment. Winters was afraid to remain in Connecticut, so much so that he fled further north to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick Douglass had initially settled after his own escape from slavery. New Bedford was a place of greater safety, and Winters remained there until Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. After that, he returned to Deep River. Both his flight from Deep River and his return pose questions for us, which we may not be able to answer. What was it in Connecticut, in Deep River, that made him so anxious when the fugitive slave law was passed? Were there indications among some that they were willing to turn him in? Whatever his reasons, in 1850, Connecticut felt as if it was still too far south. But then his return to Deep River poses another set of questions. 12 years is a long time to be away. It's long enough to build a new life, to form new associations, to become enmeshed in a whole new community. But Winters chose not to remain in New Bedford. Deep River retained a hold on him, and he decided that his future was here, in this town. And so from 1862 until his death in 1899, he remained in Deep River, living along this road and acquiring land all around here. He grew crops. He became a successful businessman. He became the owner of several other properties and earned income as a landlord. But best of all, he began to relocate his family members scattered throughout the South, who he had last seen nearly 40 years earlier in 1827. Several of them, including his sister Nancy, relocated to Deep River in order to be close to him. Near the end of his life, here's what William Winters said. He said, "I have been prosperous in many ways, and I feel that the hand of God has directed my ways, and I thank him
for taking me from a life of slavery so many years ago and placing me among a respectful and freedom-loving people. It's a wonderful testimony. We can indeed thank God that the young Daniel Fisher found refuge in Deep River. We can also thank God that later he and his family could make a home here. It's a story worth celebrating. It's a legacy worth remembering. Would that all of our towns exhibited that kind of hospitality. But here in the deep north, things are often a little more complicated than we might wish to believe. And so hold on to the story of William Winters. But let it stand in tension with another story about how an industry that was wholly dependent upon slavery came to flourish in a town known for abolitionism. David Good will take up the story from here.
We're standing at the Deep River Historical Society in front of what looks like a greenhouse, but it's not. It's a bleach house, where ivory harvested from African elephants was exposed to sunlight. From there it would be turned into piano keys, billiard balls, and other Victorian ornaments. Both Deep River and Ivoryton shared in the ivory business. It was only in 2002 that the last remaining pieces of the ivory business were sold at auction. Two names were associated with the last company sold, Julius Pratt and George Reed. Both were abolitionists in Connecticut. But here's the catch. Ivory slaves lived in Africa, not Connecticut, and so they were out of sight and perhaps out of mind. Thus abolitionists could remain untroubled in conscience. George Reed even used his home here in Deep River to house and shelter fugitive slaves. He was part of the Underground Railroad. He believed that a godly man shouldn't acquire too much wealth. Julius Pratt was eulogized in 1869 as having the blood of Puritans in his veins. But midway through the Civil War, Pratt and Reed combined their enterprises in Deep River to create Pratt, Reed and Company. They competed with Comstock Cheney and Company in Ivoryton. Both companies depended on the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people operating in eastern Africa. Elephants were hunted in the interior regions of the continent and then transported by enslaved Africans thousands of miles, usually on foot, to coastal trading centers in Mombasa, Mozambique, and Zanzibar. A rail system hadn't yet been established, and pack animals were killed by the tsetse fly. So each tusk, some of which weighed 80 pounds, had to be placed across the shoulders of an enslaved man or woman and walked all the way to the coast. Arab traders, originally from North Africa and Egypt, had settled along the coast and practiced a ruthless form of slavery. They dominated the region until the 1890s, when Europeans carved up Africa in order to create colonies, and in order, they said, to end slavery. But in the mid-1800s, the desire of industrialized America for luxury goods fit well with a version of Africa where slavery was legal and ivory plentiful. It worked well for everybody, except, of course, the tribal people of Africa. It extracted ivory, broke up their communities, left their villages in flames, mutilated the elephants, and left many shackled together, carrying huge ivory tusks for as many as 1,000 miles to the coast, where it would be sold to ships bound for here in Connecticut. Alfred Swan a missionary in Africa in the 1880s, reported this scene. He said that the feet and shoulders of the men carrying tusks were open sores, made more painful by the swarms of flies following them. David Livingston, another observer, witnessed 6 slave men singing as they marched, as if they did not feel the weight on their shoulders. When asked about the cause of their singing, he was told that they rejoiced at the idea of coming back after death and haunting and killing those who had sold them. In the years between 1884 and 1911 alone, 10 million pounds of ivory were brought to the United States. Of the thousands of tons of ivory that passed through Zanzibar, alone in those years, 75% came here to Connecticut. Even after the Civil War, even after a worldwide campaign against slavery in Africa, traders didn't want to let go of a system that worked so well for so long. Tens of thousands of Americans were buying ivory every year. But the human costs were well understood. 5 Africans were killed or forced into slavery for each elephant tusk that reached the coast. Between 1870 and 1900, at least 200,000 tusks were used by Comstock Cheney. If every tusk represents 5 people, either enslaved or killed, then Comstock Cheney represents 1 million affected Africans, just in those years. Bring in Pratt, Reed, and Deep River, which handled even more ivory than Comstock Cheney in the last decade of the 19th century, and the estimate is over 2 million people. That number doesn't reflect all the production of earlier decades. The final shipment of 4 million tons of ivory was delivered in the 1950s, but reliable shipments were harder and harder to procure. Deep River and Ivoryton are beautiful places. The ivory trade helped European immigrants establish new homes for themselves, but it did not create beautiful towns and personal fortunes for Africans. For them, it left nothing but destruction and personal suffering. So questions. What do our economic practices today hide from us? What do our consumer desires and purchases hide from us? Whose labor and whose suffering lies behind our commodity choices? Whose labor, for example, is contained in the iPhone that I carry, or a television, a garment, a piece of food? Pratt and Reed were good progressives in their era, on the vanguard of social change. But they had a fatal, willful blindness in their economic practices. For those of us today with similar progressive instincts, what sorts of willful blindness to human suffering do we maintain, simply because it would be too costly to face the truth?
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Booker Jr. and this is Wheel of Justice, Stories of the Deep North. And right now, I am at Heritage River Park in Willimantic, Connecticut. Now we all know that cotton was a dominant crop in the antebellum South. It was a crop modestly grown prior to the Revolution, but immediately after the Revolution, that changed dramatically. That occurred for 2 reasons. First, in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which quickly separated the cotton itself from the sticky seeds that clung to it. And second, in the same year, also in 1793, the nation's first industrial textile mill was started in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Those two developments made cotton an enormously profitable crop. And as a result, the entirety of the South was transformed as plantations devoted themselves almost entirely to cotton, and as states like Maryland and Virginia sent hundreds of thousands of slaves south to work on those plantations. But cotton was king not only in the South, it was king right here in the deep North as well. As cotton productions increased throughout the South, mills began to spring up in New England anywhere there was a river. Just like what you see earlier, as you saw the mills and the Willimantic River right in front of you. And especially in places where those rivers were close to shipping centers. New England had an abundance of water power in its rivers, and shippers and merchants here had enough surplus capital to invest in what was initially a risky venture. Textile mills to process all the raw cotton grown in the South. And if the South remained largely rural, and in its production of the cotton, the North was transformed into a series of industrial towns with large cotton mills at the center of their economies. But by the 1830s, cotton has surpassed wheat as the nation's largest agricultural export. But cotton products have become the nation's largest manufactured export as well. And as late as the 1820s, Willimantic, where I'm standing right now, was sparsely settled a farming community. But the Willimantic River that you saw earlier, together with its proximity to Norwich, Connecticut, a shipping town, made it a perfect place to build textile mills. Among them was one that we're standing in front of right now, the Wyndham Manufacturing Company, which is now a museum, and it started in 1823. It was a part of a huge economic and manufacturing boom in Willimantic, but also throughout Connecticut and New England more broadly. By 1861, at the start of the Civil War, Willimantic had grown to about 4,000 residents, nearly all of them employed by or dependent upon the mills. The mills that you just saw around you. Put more succinctly, they were dependent upon King Cotton. By the time of the Civil War, slavery had been abolished in Connecticut. It was illegal in 1848, much later than we like to believe, right here in the deep North. But while most people in Connecticut opposed slavery in their own state, they were perfectly willing to endeavor it elsewhere, as long as it was tucked safely out of sight. Many feared that challenging it would lead to succession and civil war, which of course is exactly what happened. And many also understood that economically they were dependent upon the existence of slavery in the South. Almost all of the cotton that arrived in Willimantic was grown and picked by enslaved people in the South. I want to say that again for all of you right there. Almost all of the cotton that arrived in Willimantic was grown and picked by enslaved people in the South. People in the northern towns feared that abolishing slavery would drive up the price of cotton, cutting into profits, and thus imperiling their own jobs and livelihood. Nevertheless, there was a strong abolitionist sentiment in many mill towns, including here in Willimantic. One reason for that may be that mill workers understood the misery of nearly indentured wage labor. And they may have identified some degree with enslaved people in the South. Speaking about the ways cotton was a joint venture of both the South and the North, with all of it dependent upon enslaved people, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote this: "Cotton threads holds the Union together. Patriotism for holidays and summer evenings, with music and rockets, but cotton thread is the Union." The Civil War did change the relationship of the mills and plantations in the South. But in the post-war years, cotton continued to be grown, often by those who were formerly enslaved, though they were still slaves in all but name. In northern towns like Willimantic, right here where I am standing right now, and others just like it, continue to receive that cotton. In light of this, here are some questions for us all to consider. In our own economic lives, how dependent are we upon exploitive relationships that occur safely out of sight? And what sorts of business arrangements do we accommodate for the sake of our own livelihoods while turning a blind eye? Remember, while turning a blind eye to the conditions under which certain commodities are produced. Just how much of the long-term wealth that was generated right here in Connecticut and other New England states was produced by preserving a relationship with slavery. In the 17th and 18th century, that occurred through the trade in the West Indies. In the 19th century, it occurred right here in Willimantic in the textile manufacturing that you saw earlier. So how deep does this run? And what, if anything, is owed? Thank you for joining. Appreciate it.
Well, we're back. And by way of conclusion, I'd like us to revisit William Winters from Deep River for just a little bit longer. Whereas the ivory trade and the textile mills present cautionary lessons about the moral blindness that too often afflicts our economic practices, William Winters helps put a human face to it all. For those with eyes to see and ears to hear, he and many others like him throughout the Deep North represented the human toll on the far side of economic supply chains, enslaved Black bodies. But few had eyes and ears to perceive such truths. Even abolitionists could be astonishingly blinkered. But Winters represents an ethical model that we do well to consider, one that stands in stark contrast to that of George Read, who gave him assistance. Change, the ability to say no, refusal to participate in dehumanizing economic practices were moral options that William Winters exercised. He did that when he refused to work any longer on the plantation where he was enslaved, and when he established a line of flight away. Something within him prevented him from acceding to that dehumanization, a something that I believe reveals the presence of God within his soul. He said no. And then he went about reinventing himself. Sadly, that same moral freedom did not seem to be available to George Read. It wasn't available to him or to many others like him all throughout the Deep North. He exercised philanthropy. He exercised hospitality. But he wasn't able to perceive the cruelty on the far side of his business practice. Moral freedom, to repent, to change, to grow, and to redress that suffering simply wasn't within his grasp. It is a tragedy. How could one form of moral outrage be so visible, the enslavement of African Americans in the United States, while another just didn't register at all? Still other questions arise. Reed, we've learned, was a leader in his church. That means that he had a minister. Maybe several over the years. We might wonder, what forms of moral address was Reed exposed to in that Baptist church? What was the content of the teaching delivered from that pulpit? It can't all have been bad. Reed was courageous in his abolition work. But looking back, what might we wish had been spoken from that pulpit and heard? What would you have said, knowing what you now know, if you were given license to speak there? For my part, I don't know. I might have said a great many things had I the courage. I might have quoted Jesus, who spoke of the religious people in his day as whitewashed sepulchres. I might have lingered on that image over the ways whiteness so often conceals the moral power of death. Or I might have quoted from the book of Genesis about how human beings, even those who are out of sight and out of mind, were also created bearing the imprint of God. Or I might have called forth repentance, like John the Baptist in the river of Jordan. Or I might have invited the congregation to reflect upon Jesus' perennial question, just who is my neighbor? Of course, I might also have simply congratulated those in the congregation for their practice of hospitality, while saying little else for fear of harming the annual budget. I don't put myself above such a possibility. What I hope, however, is that I might have spoken directly, if also gently, for their blindness is akin to mine. I hope I would have asked them to see through the concealment that is so often at play in capitalism, where the maimed bodies and lives of human laborers are tucked away safely out of sight. And then I hope I would have encouraged them to follow through on their own deepest and best instincts, which they had already realized in part toward abolition. Instead of limiting their imaginations to the borders of their own country, I would have asked them to extend those same abolitionist impulses as far as they might go, to push them outwards, even to the point of refashioning themselves all the way down. In essence, I would have reminded them of William Winters and of his own self-reinvention. I would have asked them to chart their own line of flight out of the economic and moral and spiritual chains that bind them within the deep north. That's still a vision waiting to be realized. It's still a vision that we're struggling to fulfill. But maybe by learning these stories from the deep north, we can begin to work up the courage to do what needs to be done in our time, in our day. We'll close this segment with a song. It's a song from another musician with Haitian roots, as with last week. Her name is Layla Makala. The song is called The Capitalist Blues, from an album of the same name. It's an album worth buying if you're so inclined. But the song is a blues for the deep north.
The stakes get higher. I've got the capitalist blues. When I give everything, I won't have much more to lose. I am swimming in an ocean of sharks. They are telling me how I'm gonna make my little mark in this cold, cold world. It can be such a cold, cold world. I'm not inspired. I've got the capitalist blues. And if I give everything, I won't have much more to lose. It's not fair, it's not right. I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life. It's not right, I wasn't born to just endure all this